Is a US-China war in Asia inevitable? Chinese and American officials increasingly talk about war over Taiwan and the South China Sea. Could it really happen? Chinese President Xi Jinping's recent talk of preparing for war and combat is just the latest example of tough language that has stoked fears of a military flare-up with the United States over two potential flashpoints, Taiwan and the South China Sea. Last week, Xi told his military commanders in Guangdong province to concentrate preparations for fighting a war, in comments distributed by government-run media following a 4-day visit to the south. Meanwhile, retired U.S. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges said it was likely the U.S. would be at war with China within 15 years thanks to a tense relationship and increasing competition between the world's two greatest economies. With saber-rattling on both sides, two long-standing issues between Beijing, Washington, and others have come to the fore as potential flashpoints: the disputed South China Sea and Taiwan, which China views as a renegade province. Al Jazeera spoke with U.S.-China experts who said while all-out conflict was possible, there remained chances to negotiate, compromise and manage a competitive relationship between Washington and Beijing that did not need turn ugly. They're both preparing for it, but it would take an incredibly stupid leadership in both countries to end up in a war between the US and China, Bonnie Glaser, a former Pentagon consultant, told Al Jazeera. Smart policies can take us in a more positive direction, sharpening approach. Washington's efforts to manage and accommodate China's growing economic and military clout have shifted under U.S. President Donald Trump, who has slapped tariffs on Chinese imports and accused Beijing of trading unfairly and stealing intellectual property. This month, Vice President Mike Pence spoke at a conservative think tank about cyber attacks, Taiwan, freedom of the seas and human rights in a policy address that highlighted a sharpening U.S. approach to China beyond the bitter trade war. Pence said China was waging a sophisticated effort to sway the elections against Trump's Republicans in retaliation for the White House's trade policies. He vowed to continue exposing Beijing's malign influence and interference. China was deploying anti-ship and anti-air missiles on artificial islands in the disputed South China Sea, Pence said. He also accused Beijing of bullying smaller countries and destabilizing Taiwan by pressuring 3 Latin American countries to cut ties with Taipei. There have already been real-world consequences. Last month, the USS Decatur was sailing near Gavin Reef in the South China Sea, when a Chinese destroyer approached within 45 meters and forced the U.S. vessel to maneuver to avoid a collision, the Americans said. Washington sends warships on so-called freedom of navigation exercises through the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait to show they are international waters and counter Chinese claims, as well as bolster U.S. allies in the region. The Trump administration has struck 2 arms deals with Taiwan worth more than $1.7 billion combined. In September, Washington slapped sanctions on China's military for buying fighter jets and missile systems from Russia. China has responded by calling off high-level military-to-military talks, canceling U.S. Secretary of Defense James Mattis' visit to Beijing and conducting live fire drills with bombers and fighter jets in the South China Sea. While China's economic growth has been slowed by the trade war, it is still expanding more than twice as fast as the U.S., and the state is pouring money into new technologies, such as quantum computing, biotech and artificial intelligence. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, China has launched more submarines, warships and other vessels since 2014 than the number of ships currently serving in the combined navies of Germany, India, Spain, Taiwan and Britain. South China Sea dispute. Analysts recall past political crises between the U.S. and China. In 2001, a U.S. spy plane was forced to land on Hainan after colliding with a Chinese fighter jet. In 1996, then U.S. President Bill Clinton dispatched aircraft carriers to the Taiwan Strait over Chinese missile tests. There's a whole basket of issues that could lead to a U.S.-China conflict, Gregory Poling, an Asia and maritime law expert at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, told Al Jazeera. The South China Sea is the thorniest. It gets right at the heart of U.S. primacy in the region, the international order that Washington built up since World War II and China's willingness to bully neighbors and challenge that rules-based order. The sea covers some 1.7 million square kilometers and contains more than 200 mostly uninhabitable small islands, rocks and reefs. It is the shortest route between the Pacific and Indian Oceans and has some of the world's busiest shipping lanes. Brunei, China, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan and Vietnam are involved in a complex set of historically based territorial disputes there. China's claims, the broadest, cover all of the Spratly and Paracel Islands, and most of the South China Sea. The dispute has intensified political and military rivalry across the region between the rising power of China, which has been projecting its growing naval reach, and the long-dominant player, the United States, which is deepening its ties with Japan, the Philippines and others. Washington needs to wake up and realize that while the South China Sea is quiet right now, we are losing. Every day the Chinese position gets stronger, the positions of the other claimants gets weaker, and they have to question the credibility of the U.S. more every day, polling said. There are also signs of progress, added polling. This year, the 10-member Association of Southeast Asian Nations (ASEAN) and China started formal talks on a legally binding code of conduct to ease tensions over the strategic waterway. There's a lot of cynicism because talks have gone nowhere for the past 20 years, said polling. But there's nothing fundamental that makes this impossible. There's nothing in the legal positions of China, the other claimants, and international law that can't allow for a negotiated settlement. This stuff is doable. Taiwan is also spoken about as a powder keg. Last week, China's Minister of Defense Wei Feng vowed any effort to separate Taiwan from China would result in China's armed forces taking action at any price. China has claimed self-ruled Taiwan through its One China policy since 1949 and vows to bring it under Beijing's rule, by force if necessary. The U.S. is obliged to help Taiwan with the means to defend itself under the U.S. Congress 1979 Taiwan Relations Act. Despite military build-ups, the intensifying trade war and heated rhetoric, Glazer said cooler heads will likely prevail in Beijing and Washington, even when warships skirt past each other and hot rod pilots undertake daredevil flybys. Over the next 20 to 25 years, I wouldn't necessarily expect a hot war or even something like the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, but a prolonged, intense, strategic competition between China and the US that won't end with the Trump administration, said Glazer.